education, not only in the land of Egypt, but at that time in the world where he would have been trained. And how did he use these degrees? Well, we're looking at one of the ways he used them. He would pen the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and our book of Deuteronomy. So, we think about our kids going back to school. And what's one of your favorite classes? English class, right, Tobiah? You know what? You never know what classes you're going through. Science, history, math, English, how God will use them. And, militarily, Moses was qualified as well. But you know what? You can be too overqualified for this institution, because what it does is it attempts to strip you of everything that you think that you're good at and get you to a point like Moses, where by the time Moses would be done, he saw that he was totally insufficient, and he saw that God was completely sufficient for his needs. Sometimes the greatest problem in our Christian walk is we fail to see our insufficiency and Christ's sufficiency. How are you enrolled into the Desert University? Well, you can't sign up yourself, because nobody would ever do that. You have to be appointed, kind of like West Point, where you can't just go and enroll. You've got to receive an appointment. So the enrollment at the Desert University is by divine appointment. You never know when God is going to place you there. Moses probably thought he would rise up, help Israel overthrow the Egyptians, and he would be all done. Little did he know, he was headed for a greater degree. Sometimes your life is going well, and you find yourself in a hospital bed. You find yourself in a place where you just don't want to be. It could very well be that God is enrolling you in his Desert University. Well, let's be encouraged tonight, though, and look at some of the alumni that are enrolled or had been enrolled in the Desert University. It goes all the way back to Genesis. There was a guy by the name of Noah. Now, he maybe needed a little more time. He took 100 years. And his course was a course called ark building. He had to build a boat out where there was no water, and everybody made fun of him and laughed at him. But Moses continued in Desert University, and then he even took another course. He took a course in flood management for 40 days and 40 nights. It rained upon the earth. And then he took a third course in waiting for the floods to rescend. We skip ahead to Abraham. He spent 25 years in Desert University taking a course called Waiting for the Promised Son. God promised him he'd have a son named Isaac, and it didn't come right away. In fact, he made some pretty big errors when he took a wife named Hagar and had a son by the name of Ishmael. But eventually, Abraham would learn to walk by faith, and all of Israel and the entire world would be blessed from it. Isaac took a course on wife finding. It's interesting, Isaac would be 40 years of age when he would find a wife by the name of Rebekah. Jacob and Joseph, father son, kind of went together, and they took two courses unbeknownst at the same time. Jacob took a course called Thinking You've Lost a Son, and Joseph took a course called Forsaken by All But God. Their courses would take almost 15 years to complete, but when all was said and done, they would save not only the nation of Israel, but the entire world. Interesting, sticking with the number 40, Jacob would be embalmed for 40 days after he died. Pharaoh, through the guidance of Joseph, would take a course of Egypt called Surviving a 7-Year Famine. This is the Pharaoh at the end of the book of Genesis, and would pass it. Israel, then as a nation, took a course called Slavery in Egypt for 400 years. They would be in Egypt. Moses, we were looking at him, took several. Then he ushered in others. This is one of the things you do. You graduate from Desert University, and then you're able to help others. Moses helped Israel take a course called Wandering in the Wilderness for 40 years. He also had them take a course called Surviving on Manna for 40 years, and then just a brief little introductory course when they first got out of Egypt called Waiting for the 10 Commandments. That took 40 days and 40 nights. Moses, after Israel sinned, would take an additional course called Pleading and Praying for God's Mercy. He prayed for 40 days and 40 nights for Israel. 12 spies of Israel took a 40-day course as they went into the land of Canaan, and it was entitled Trust God Regardless of What You See. Unfortunately for the 12 spies, 10 of them failed, but 2 passed. Caleb, by the way, would be 40 when he would be a spy. The book of Judges, there's 40 years of occupation. There's also 40 years of peace in the book. Elijah took a course called God is Still on the Throne. He called fire down from heaven, and then he fled from Jezebel, and God has him, he wants to die, has him go to a place called Mount Horeb, which is very interesting, also a place called Mount Sinai. And he would fast there for 40 days and then would receive the still small voice from God. Nineveh took a course entitled Repent and Be Saved. 40 days and 40 nights they repented, they fasted, they prayed, and God would save their city. John the Baptist took a course. He lived most of his life on the backside of a desert. His was pointing men to the Messiah, and he did well with that. Jesus himself shows the example by taking a couple of courses called Tempted in the Desert, 40 days and 40 nights. He also appeared for 40 days after the resurrection to his followers. Peter, in Acts, healed a man that was lame from birth. How old do you think that guy was? He was 40 years old. You're catching on. And then even the Apostle Paul, we're taught, would go to Arabia in the desert for 2 years, and he'd have to learn about a course called His Grace is Sufficient for Me. You know, all throughout the ages and through the Bible, there have been men and women who have had to go through difficult times and challenging experiences where God's sovereign hand had led them there so that they could learn. Now, I want to say this as we carry on, that there's a difference between desertion and the desert, okay? If you got a problem in your life, you feel like I'm on the backside of a desert, things just aren't going well. Well, if you're right with God, you very well could be in the desert. If you're not right with God, you know you've done wrong and you're not living the way you should, don't go around touting yourself saying, I'm in Desert University. No, you've deserted God. God doesn't desert you, but you can desert him. And when you desert God, you're going to find that the Lord is going to chasten you. Proverbs 13:15 reminds us the way of the transgressor is hard. So when you find yourself in the middle of a difficult situation, make sure that you try to distinguish, is it God refining you under his sun, or is it God rebuking you under a hot desert sun, S-U-N? Charles Swindoll said it this way: God never puts us through the blast furnace in the desert to ruin us. He does it to refine us. Well, how could God refine us being on the backside of the desert? Moses probably had no idea when he started. How could God refine me with my health issues? How could God refine me when I tried to do this for God and I fell flat on my face? It's amazing the ways of God. They're past our own understanding. We see number 2, the course explanation. What course will you be taking here? Well, it's not about head knowledge. You go down to ISU, Ivy Tech, even the Crown College, your wife will hit you in the face, and then you have to learn. She really wants you to learn head knowledge there, Brother George. And they'll put a lot of facts and figures, and there's places for all of those things. But what God doesn't want to do is he doesn't want to get a hold of you here. He wants to get a hold of you here. He wants to get a hold of you through hard knowledge. And it's amazing. Christ is quite the teacher. He's like no other teacher around. What he does is he lovingly guides us through the course in order to make us stronger. And he wants us to get to the point where we can be like the psalmist who said in Psalm 34 and verse 8, "Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good." You know, the Psalms are a lot about desert experiences. David had many times where he was out in the wilderness fleeing from Saul. How did he become the king that was so wise and was a man after God's own heart? I think he learned a lot of his lessons, enrolled in, maybe not, he might not have called it Desert University, but he'd call it Wilderness University. And as he pens the Psalms, one is Psalm 119. I want to look at a few verses here. Psalm 119, verse 66. "Teach me good judgment and knowledge, for I have believed thy commandments." Verse 67. Look at this. "Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now have I kept thy word. Skip ahead to verse 71 if you're with us. It is good for me that I've been afflicted. You're getting close to graduating when you could say that. It's good for me that I've been in this hospital. It's good for me that I've had this difficult situation. Why? That I might learn thy statutes. And boy, I think verse 71 has to be probably the college verse. It's motto, it's creed. It's good for me that I have been afflicted, that I might learn thy statutes. And then verse 72 rounds it off and says, the law of thy mouth is better unto me than thousands of gold and silver. You get to a point where you recognize money isn't where it's all at. Fame isn't where it's all at. Think about Moses as he left Egypt. He left Egypt and everybody knew his name. Now he's walking around with scorpions and serpents, and lucky if he even sees one person in the middle of a day. Moses had all of the comforts he could possibly have, the best of food, the best things to drink, the best living conditions. And now what's he doing? He's probably eating off of bugs, snakes, whatever game he can catch. He's going to the nearest muddy water hole and trying to get the mud out of the water so that he can drink it. Can I tell you, Moses is in not as good a place as he used to be, but I tell you what, the earth would say, or world would say, no way, that's not where we want to be. But I tell you, God says that's exactly where you need to be. You know, the world, when they think about affliction, they're baffled. Why would God allow affliction? Carnal Christians will get bitter when it comes to affliction and say, God's not good and God doesn't care. But a Spirit-led Christian sees God working in every area of their life. And even in the difficult circumstances, he says, God is doing this so that I can be better. What does the course involve? It's got 4 major subjects: loneliness, lowliness, longing, and looking. First one is loneliness. Boy, nothing harder in life than being lonely. If you study military history, you'll know some of the ways they break people when they interrogate them is they put them in isolation. They put them in a cell all by themselves, and it breaks so many people. Well, you don't have to be in a prison camp or in a cell to feel isolated. Sometimes you can feel isolated in a crowd like this. Sometimes you can feel isolated at work with people coming in and going out. God had to get Moses away from all of the people so that then he could be like David and he could say, you know what, I'm going to be still and know that he is God. I'm going to get away from what people are saying and how people are pushing and what I'm worried about, what people think about me. And I'm going to only be able to look to one and only person, and that is God. You know, if we're not careful, when God puts us in a place of isolation, we can make the mistake of distraction. I know when I traveled for Pensacola when I graduated, for 2 years I traveled on my own, and I thought, man, it's going to be great. Hotel every night. Amen, Brother Rob. Eating out every meal. Well, I was all by myself, much like Rob and some others. And I tell you what, it got lonely after a while. Now, you get to come home after a while. I was on the road for 3.5 solid months all by myself. And I tell you what, it got depressing. It got lonely. I told my boss that once, and he said, you're at school with hundreds of kids, and you're at churches with hundreds of people. I said, it's a superficial thing. Hi, how you doing? What you doing? You know, it just gets to a point to where you get so lonely that I'd come home and I'd turn the game on. I'd come home, go to the hotel, and I'd turn the game on. And a lot of times I'd leave that TV on as I went to bed because I thought, you know, that noise would kind of hide or mask the fact that I was so lonely. I tell you what, I look back on that, and not that those things can't help to some degree, but instead I could have maybe directed myself a little bit more to the Lord. You know, if we're not careful, we put the earbuds in or we turn something on. Can I tell you, sometimes when you're all alone, it's kind of a perfect time for you just to seek the Lord. We find God has Moses in the desert in a lowly place. It's interesting, the word desert in Hebrew means to speak. You know, God has to mute all the other voices around you so that he could speak to you. Not only do you learn loneliness, you learn lowliness. Moses went from being a man who commits murder to being called one of the meekest men who ever lived. You know what meekness is? Meekness is power under control. You know, it's interesting. After the Ten Commandments and Israel fails, God says, I'll wipe out Israel. You know, I'll make a new nation under your name. I think the Moses at 40 years of age would have said, yeah, let's do this. But after he'd been on the backside of a desert, I think he was a different kind of an individual that said, no, God, we'll spare them. What about your name? And he prays some of the most remarkable prayers that we will get to on behalf of the nation of Israel. It's interesting. The first thing Moses comes to, according to our passage here in Exodus chapter 2, is he comes to Midian, and he sits down by a well. And it says the priests of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled their troughs to water their father's flock. And the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up, and he helped them, and he watered their flock. That's first that job he has for him is, hey, out here in the desert, there are these gals, they need help watering their flocks. You do it, Moses. Here's a guy that was going to be the next Pharaoh of Egypt. Boy, God has a way of leading us. You know, Theodore Epp said it was Moses' disappointment, but this became God's appointment. God was getting him to where he would look to God in loneliness. He would humble himself in lowliness. He got to where he would have a longing for God. You know, you think about the desert, you think about how hot it is and how you're looking for water. Moses would get to a point where he would have a great desire for the things of God, to where he would say to God, show me your glory. And he got one of the rare opportunities, as we'll see later in the book, to see not the face of God, because no one can see the face of God and live, but he saw the hinder parts of God, and he hid him in the cleft of the rock. He learned loneliness, lowliness, longing, and he learned looking. He learned to look to God. He learned to look to see where God was, and he learned to listen to God as well. We've seen tonight the college enrollment. We've seen the course explanation, and now as we finish, we see the completion of the exam. How does one know that his exam is complete? Well, we read on, when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, this is the ladies at the well, how is it that you're come so soon today? And they said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hands of the shepherds, and he drew water enough for us and watered the flock. And he said to his daughters, and where is he? Why is it that you've left this man? We need to get you all married off out of here. Call him that he may eat bread. And Moses was content. Ding, 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 ding. There is step number 1. You find you're completing your time at Desert University. You learn to be content wherever you're at. Well, there's a lot of people that have never mastered Desert University because they're not happy or they're not content no matter what it is God places in their life. Here he's on the backside of a desert with people he doesn't know, and Moses, it says, was content to dwell with the man, and the man gave Moses Zipporah, his daughter, and she bare him a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a strange land. He learned to trust God. He learned that even in strange places and strange situations, that God was working. D.L. Moody said it this way: for the first 40 years, Moses thought that he was somebody. For the next 20 years, Moses realized he was nobody. And the last 40 years, Moses realized God can use nobodies. We find that the signs that we're completing our exam is that we're content, but also that we have a renewed concentration on God. We find that it came to pass in the process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of bondage, and they cried, and their cry came up unto God by reason of bondage. God heard their groanings. God remembered the covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob, and God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them. Moses is going to have another son by the name of Eleazar, and he's going to learn to do what Israel's doing here, cry out to God. He says, God, Eleazar means God is my help. You know, God was already helping Moses before Moses knew it. The Midianites were descendants of Keturah. Do you know who Keturah is? She would be Abraham's second wife. Her descendants would have one by the name of Ruel, which means friend of God. And Moses' father-in-law would be a great encouragement and help to him in his life. And so I don't know where you're at tonight. Maybe you feel lonely and all alone. Maybe you feel defeated, forsaken. Can I tell you, if you love God and you're following him and you're right with him, it very well could be that God has you doing this difficult time in your life so that you can learn to be more like him, so that you can help other people, and so that you can do what God has called all of us to do, to glorify God. There's a poem that says this: "My life is but a weaving between my Lord and me. I cannot choose the colors, he worketh steadily. Oft times he weaveth sorrow, and I in foolish pride forget he sees the upper, and I the underside. Not till the loom is silent and the shuttle ceases to fly shall God unroll the canvas and explain the reasons why. The dark threads are as needful in the weaver's skillful hand as the threads of gold and silver in the pattern he has planned. He knows, he loves, he cares. Nothing this truth condemn. He gives his very best to those who leave their choice to him." May we recognize that God is weaving a wonderful pattern in our life. May we trust him. And if you're enrolled in Desert University, knuckle down, study hard, because you'll be glad that you did. Let's quietly stand, please, with our heads bowed and our eyes closed.